The courtroom was thick with tension, each breath seemingly caught in the throats of those present. Sergeant Ethan Carter sat at the center, hands cuffed, wearing his decorated military uniform like a painful reminder of what he had once been. Medals that symbolized bravery and sacrifice gleamed under the cold lights, but they offered no comfort in the face of the grim reality. Ethan had been found guilty of murdering 2 civilians during a classified mission overseas. The verdict was final, the sentence, death by electric chair. For weeks, Ethan had sat in silence, resigned to his fate. But on this day, he raised his head, voice tight with emotion, and made one final request: to see his partner Jagger, the military 9 who had served by his side. The mention of the dog's name caused a ripple through the courtroom. Jagger wasn't just a service animal. He was Ethan's closest comrade, a Belgian Malinois who had saved lives and stood firm through the chaos of war. The judge hesitated, clearly thrown off by the unusual request. Before he could respond, Captain Emma Wilson, a former colleague and one of the few who had stood by Ethan during the trial, rose from the back of the room. Her voice was steady and firm as she addressed the court, declaring that Jagger was a veteran too, one who had risked his life for the country just like Ethan. Denying this request, she argued, would be inhumane. A heavy silence fell as the judge weighed her words. Eventually, he gave a reluctant nod, granting Ethan 10 minutes with the dog under strict supervision. The courtroom stirred with whispers as Ethan closed his eyes and exhaled a slow, shaky breath. It wasn't forgiveness he sought, nor was it a delay of justice. He just needed to say goodbye to the one being who had never judged him, who had remained loyal when the world had turned its back. As he was led down the hallway toward a private room, every step felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 regrets. Then came the sound, the faint jingle of a collar, claws tapping on the tile floor. The door opened, and there he was. Jagger didn't hesitate. The dog moved with quiet urgency, his eyes locked on Ethan, and in seconds he was at his chest, front paws resting gently as if to steady him. Ethan, a man who had stared down death countless times on the battlefield, broke. He collapsed to his knees, his body shaking as he buried his face in Jagger's fur. "You never gave up on me, did you, boy?" he whispered, voice cracking under the weight of so many emotions. Jagger pressed his muzzle to Ethan's cheek, letting out a soft whine, a sound that carried years of shared experience of war zones and quiet nights, of survival and trust. In that fragile moment, the walls Ethan had built to protect himself began to crumble, and for the first time since his conviction, a flicker of something new sparked inside him, not hope, not yet, but a memory, distant and blurry, clawing its way to the surface. As Ethan held Jagger close, time seemed to stand still. The cold steel walls around them faded into the background as years of shared battles, dust-covered roads, and quiet moments between missions came rushing back. He ran his fingers slowly through Jagger's thick coat, using the rhythmic motion to anchor himself. For the first time since the trial, something in his mind stirred. A memory faint, broken, pushed its way to the surface. He gripped Jagger's collar harder, eyes squeezed shut, trying to piece it together. The mission had gone wrong in a flash. One moment, they were advancing with caution. The next, there was screaming, gunfire, and chaos. But now, with Jagger's steady presence grounding him, Ethan remembered something strange, a voice, one he hadn't registered before, shouting an order that didn't fit the situation. It hadn't made sense then. But now, that voice echoed louder in his head, and with it came a sinking realization. It had been a setup. Someone had intentionally led them into a deadly trap, knowing civilians would be in the crossfire. Someone had orchestrated the entire disaster, and he had taken the fall for it. Ethan's heart pounded against his ribs, each beat sharper than the last. For weeks, he had combed through every detail in his mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. But grief, shame, and hopelessness had clouded everything. Now, sitting on that cold metal chair with Jagger's head resting gently on his lap, clarity cut through the fog. He began replaying every second from that night the mission known as Operation Dawn Strike. He remembered the false coordinates, the confusion in the squad, and the exact moment the shooting started. But more than anything, he remembered Jagger. The dog had been right there, outfitted like all military 9s with a vest-mounted camera, recording everything. That camera could have captured the shooter, the real cause of the chaos, the proof he needed. "Jadu," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of sudden possibility. "Your camera. Do you still have the footage?" It was a long shot. Evidence from that night had likely been locked away or destroyed after the trial. But if even a shred of that footage remained, it might be his only hope. The sound of a guard's voice broke the fragile silence. 5 minutes, the man said gruffly, standing in the doorway. Ethan's stomach twisted. 5 minutes wasn't enough not to explain, not to say goodbye, not to figure out what came next. He looked down at Jagger, who gazed back with unwavering loyalty, his ears perked as if he understood every word. "You might be the only one who can save me now," Ethan said, tears welling in his eyes. He didn't know if the footage still existed or if anyone would help him recover it, but he couldn't give up. Not now. As the guard stepped forward, Ethan lowered his forehead to rest against Jagger's. "I'll figure it out, buddy," he whispered, voice cracking. The dog resisted as they pulled him away, his body straining to stay close. Ethan's chest burned as the door closed between them. He was alone again, but something had changed. The haze of defeat had been replaced by a flicker of purpose. That memory, that footage, it could be his way out. And for the first time in weeks, he felt like maybe, just maybe, the truth wasn't lost forever. Back in his cell, Ethan sat on the edge of his cot, his thoughts spinning like a storm that refused to settle. The dim light above flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls, but he barely noticed it anymore. All he could think about was that moment with Jagger and the possibility that the footage from his vest still existed. It was a thin thread, but it was all he had. That memory hadn't just stirred up pain, it had unearthed a clue, one that could change everything. But if the footage was still out there, it was buried somewhere deep in military archives, locked behind layers of clearance and red tape. He knew that even if he was right, retrieving it wouldn't be easy. Time wasn't on his side. Every mark he had carved into the concrete wall beside his bed was a cruel reminder of the days slipping away. He closed his eyes and thought of the only person who had ever stood by him when the world turned its back, Captain Emma Wilson. Emma had always been different. She wasn't just another officer, she was someone who believed in doing what was right, even when it cost her. She had spoken up for him during the trial, her voice one of the few that hadn't been silenced by fear or politics. If anyone had a shot at finding that footage, it was her. The problem was, contacting her would be a challenge. Death Row didn't exactly offer privacy or access to the outside world, but Ethan had one chance left: a final phone call, a privilege granted to the condemned. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. That evening, he convinced the guards to let him use the phone. Sitting in the visitation room, cuffed and under surveillance, he dialed her number from memory, unsure if she would even answer. The phone rang twice before she picked up, her voice cautious, unsure. "Hello?" she said, the sound of shuffling papers in the background. "Emma, it's me," Ethan said, clutching the receiver like it was his lifeline. There was a pause, a breath of disbelief before she answered, her tone suddenly laced with concern. "Ethan, are you even calling me? You didn't waste time. Listen, I need your help. Jagger's vest, it had a camera, the night of the mission. Do you think the footage still exists?" The line went silent, and Ethan's heart thudded in his chest. Finally, Emma spoke. "I don't know. After your trial, a lot of evidence was sealed or destroyed. But if it's anywhere, it's in the secure evidence vault on base." Ethan leaned forward, voice low and urgent. "Emma, please. You're the only one I trust. If there's even a chance, I need you to find it. That footage could prove I didn't fire those shots." Another pause. Then her voice firmed with quiet resolve. "Okay, I'll try. But if they catch me looking into this, it could cost me everything." Guilt welled in Ethan's throat, but he swallowed it down. "I know, and I'm sorry. I wouldn't ask if I had another choice." A guard motioned for him to hang up. "Thank you, Emma," he whispered. "Be careful." As he returned to his cell, for the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope burned quietly in the darkness. The night air was thick with tension as Emma walked briskly through the empty corridors of the military base. She had been stationed here for years, knew every hallway and checkpoint like the back of her hand, but tonight, everything felt foreign, hostile. Her boots echoed against the polished floor, each step a gamble. She clutched her keycard tightly, heart pounding as she approached the first security gate. The access scanner blinked red, then green, and the door clicked open. So far, so good. She moved quickly, careful to avoid security cameras and patrol patterns she had memorized from routine drills. The evidence vault was located deep in the restricted wing of the base, secured behind multiple doors and surveillance layers. What she was about to do wasn't just against protocol, it was treason. But she didn't hesitate. Ethan's voice over the phone, desperate, hopeful, replayed in her mind. If there was even a sliver of truth in what he remembered, this footage could be the key to saving his life. Inside the vault, the air was colder, almost sterile. Rows of lockers stretched out before her, each one containing remnants of past missions, weapons, devices, sealed files. She scanned the tags quickly, her eyes darting from one to the next until she found the one marked Operation Dawnstrike. Her breath caught. Her fingers trembled slightly as she slid the drawer open. Inside were a handful of photos, mission logs, and finally, a small, dust-covered hard drive. She stared at it for a moment, hardly believing it still existed. Then she slipped it into her jacket. The sound of footsteps outside made her freeze. A flashlight beam swept across the gap under the vault door. Voices, two men, chatting, unaware someone was inside. Emma's instincts kicked in. She scanned the room and spotted a maintenance hatch in the corner. Moving fast but silently, she crossed the vault, opened the hatch, and crawled through just as the vault door creaked open behind her. She held her breath, heart hammering in her ears as the space narrowed around her. The hard drive pressed against her ribs, feeling heavier by the second. Finally, she emerged outside into the cold night, gulping in fresh air. The base was behind her, but the danger wasn't over, not even close. Hours later, parked in an abandoned lot miles from the base, Emma sat hunched over her laptop. The glow of the screen lit her tense face as she connected the hard drive and opened its contents. She hesitated for a moment, knowing this was the moment of truth. Then, with a deep breath, she clicked on the first file. The screen flickered to life. Jagger's point of view. The video was grainy but intact. It showed Ethan's team advancing through a ruined building, voices crackling over comms. Then the chaos started: gunfire, shouts, and suddenly, a figure in civilian clothing appearing out of nowhere. Emma's stomach twisted as the screen lit up with muzzle flashes, but she kept watching. One voice, Ethan's, rose above the rest. "Hold fire. Civilians." But the shots still rang out. The camera shifted. And then, there it was. A shadowy figure in a familiar uniform raising a rifle and firing directly at the civilians. Emma paused the video, her hands cold on the keyboard. She rewound, played it again, this time focusing on the shooter. The resolution was poor, but the uniform and body language were unmistakable. It was someone from Ethan's own team. Her blood ran cold. Ethan had been telling the truth all along. He hadn't pulled the trigger. He had been set up. But by who and why? Emma's hands were still trembling as she stared at the frozen image on her screen. Grainy, but damning. The shooter wasn't Ethan. It was someone else wearing the same uniform, moving with calculated intent. She rewound the footage again and again, narrowing her focus, praying for more detail. Each time, it became clearer. The shooter had acted independently, deliberately. But just as Emma was preparing to save the enhanced image, her phone buzzed against the dashboard. She snatched it up, her stomach tightening as she read the caller ID unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Captain Wilson," a cold, authoritative voice said. "This is Colonel Briggs. I need to speak with you immediately." Her blood ran cold. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice neutral. "We've been alerted to irregular activity in the evidence vault. Report to my office at 700. This isn't optional." The call ended before she could respond. Panic surged in her chest as she realized they knew. Someone had discovered the breach, and she was now a target. As she sat in her car, heart pounding, headlights approached slowly in the distance. Her instincts screamed at her, and she didn't wait. Emma threw the laptop into the passenger seat, slammed the car into gear, and sped off into the night. She needed help, someone outside the military who could get this footage into the right hands before it disappeared like everything else connected to Ethan's case. Her mind immediately went to Ryan Blake, a former investigative journalist she had crossed paths with during her early years in the military. He had been kicked out for digging too deep, for uncovering truths the higher-ups didn't want exposed. If anyone understood what she was up against, it was Ryan. They met in a deserted diner on the edge of town just before sunrise. Ryan was cautious at first, watching her closely as she placed the hard drive on the table. "You realize this puts a target on both of us, right?" he asked, voice low. Emma didn't flinch. "I don't have a choice. Ethan has days left. If we don't act now, he dies for something he didn't do." After a long silence, Ryan nodded. "All right, let's do this." They drove to a safe house, a rundown apartment on the edge of the city, Windows blacked out, equipment already set up. Ryan moved quickly, scanning the hard drive, enhancing the footage frame by frame. Emma paced anxiously, her eyes flicking toward the door at every creak. Finally, Ryan froze the video and zoomed in. The image sharpened just enough to make out the shooter's face. Emma's heart sank. "Oh my God," she whispered. "That's Lieutenant Greg Harlow." It felt like the wind had been knocked out of her. She had served with him, trusted him. Harlow had always been overly ambitious, but she never imagined he was capable of something like this. Ryan looked grim. If he's involved, there's a network behind him. This wasn't a one-man decision. Emma nodded slowly, the reality settling over her like a lead blanket. Harlow had rank, connections, influence. If he found out they had this footage, he'd do everything to bury it along with them. There was no going through official channels anymore. The military wasn't going to save Ethan. They had to go public, and they had to move fast before Harlow made his next move. Emma's breath was shallow as she clutched the hard drive and slipped out of the diner. The air was heavy, her pulse racing. She and Ryan had exposed a powerful man, Lieutenant Harlow, and now there was no turning back. The military would come after them, not because they were wrong, but because they were right. They split up to reduce the risk. Ryan would reach out to a trusted hacker to help access the original mission logs, proof that the footage hadn't been tampered with. Emma's task was riskier. To find someone in the military command chain who wasn't corrupt, someone who couldn't be bought. There was only one name that came to mind: General Marcus Ellison, a man known for his integrity. She drove straight to the base he was stationed at, heart pounding with every mile. When she arrived, she demanded to see him, citing a matter of life and death. After tense minutes, waiting in the lobby, she was finally led into his office. Without wasting a second, she placed the hard drive on his desk. "Sir, this proves Sergeant Ethan Carter was framed. But it also implicates Harlow in the civilian deaths. I need your help." Ellison's expression hardened as he reviewed the footage. "If what's on here is real," he said quietly, "this isn't just one bad officer. This is a cover-up." He didn't make any promises, only told her to leave the drive with him. Emma left the office, unsure she'd just found a lifeline or handed over the only proof that could save Ethan's life. The sun had long set by the time Emma returned to her car, nerves fraying. She hadn't heard back from Ellison, and every minute that passed felt like another inch closer to Ethan's execution. Her phone buzzed and her blood ran cold at the name flashing on the screen. "Harlow," she answered, her voice sharp. "What do you want?" He was calm, too calm. "I know what you've been doing." "You're in over your head, Captain." Emma didn't reply, but her silence was answer enough. "Walk away," he said before hanging up. Her hands shook on the steering wheel. She started the engine and peeled out of the parking lot, only to notice headlights following her. Panic flooded her chest. She tried to lose them through winding streets and alleyways, eventually pulling into an abandoned industrial lot. She ducked out of the car with the hard drive, hiding behind rusted machinery as the pursuing vehicle came to a stop. Men in dark suits emerged, armed and moving fast. She held her breath, her body tensed. A clatter on the far side of the lot distracted them. Some miracle, some random noise, and she used the chance to run. Heart pounding, lungs burning, she sprinted through a hole in the fence and kept running until she reached a payphone to call Ryan. "They found me," she said breathlessly. "But I still have the drive. Meet me at the old train depot. It was their last shot. If they didn't get this footage out now, they wouldn't live long enough to try again." The depot was quiet, too quiet, as Emma slipped inside and saw Ryan already working. They didn't speak. There was no time for that. He uploaded the footage to every whistleblower site and major news outlet they could reach. Just as the progress bar hit 95%, screeching tires echoed outside. They had been found. Emma gripped a wrench, Ryan raised his gun, and they prepared for the worst. The gunfire that followed was deafening, but somehow they held out until sirens wailed and backup arrived. The footage had gone live. The truth could no longer be hidden. Days later, Ethan's conviction was overturned, and Harlow was arrested. The reunion outside the prison gates between Ethan and Jagger brought tears to Emma's eyes. But beyond the headlines and the justice served, the story struck a deeper chord. In a world where systems fail and power often protects itself, sometimes it takes one brave voice, followed by another, to expose the truth. Emma's fight wasn't just about saving a friend. It was a reminder that silence protects the guilty, and speaking out, no matter the cost, is the first step toward justice. For anyone watching, the message is clear. Real heroes aren't the ones with medals, they're the ones who risk everything to do what's right when no one else will.